So today on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Karen Walczyk Prescott, author of Polish Mother. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it is good. It's good to have you here. I loved the book. I could not put it down. I read it while I was on one of my little escapes from home where I had a few days, and I couldn't put it down. But before we get really into the book, why don't you tell listeners what they will get when they open these pages?
This book is an immigrant story, and most of us are immigrants to this country. So on that level, they can connect with it. It's based on true events. Some of us really love nonfiction, and what I've tried to do is make it creative nonfiction. So it really is based on true events, and it's because I've researched and got primary source documentation. So it's interesting to readers to know that this really happened. As close to the truth as I could be, it really is. And it's got some weird nuance to it because that's our lives. Our lives are not, picture perfect. We all have issues and problems and stuff happens and crazy things. So I think it's very plot driven. And I think that if somebody is interested in a story that really moves along, they'll enjoy it. And also, if you're Polish American, it's your ancestry for the most part. So I think that's important.
So that's one of the things I was going to talk to you about, is that in your note at the very beginning, you state that this is a work of creative nonfiction. For those people who are listening that don't know what creative nonfiction is, to me, most people, when they think nonfiction, what could possibly be creative about facts? So can you explain what is creative nonfiction?
I think of it as, it takes me back to high school, middle or high school, when you're sitting and listening to a history professor or a teacher, even in college. And the good professors or teachers were the ones that brought out the human element and actually made the people from the past come to life. And so that to me was the beginning of creative nonfiction, having a teacher who was able to present history in a way that was exciting and interesting and captivating. Not just reading about dates and times and this war or that war, or this, migration of people, but bringing the story to life. So I think of that as creative nonfiction, taking what happened in our past and bringing it to life.
Right. And the way you brought it to life was there was a lot of dialogue that certainly can't be known.
Imagined, what would be the dialogue? And of course, the only way I could do that is with extensive research.
Exactly.
What would be an appropriate thing for them to be talking about?
Right. And the dialogue, though, could not be known exactly. You'd never really know if your great-grandmother said those words. So I think that's kind of the creative part, is when you're able to go in and do all this research and then come in and provide color in a way that makes you get very engaged with the story.
There is only one little piece of dialogue, which isn't really dialogue because it had to do with my great-grandmother, and she had many grandchildren. This is Henrika or Henrietta in the story. And she told us many, many times about two things: the story of the Golden Arm, which is in the story, and then about my great-grandfather, who was best friends with the Native Americans, with the Indians. Right. And she had a call that they used to yell across Oneida Lake, and it was yippee kanini kazini kazaka boodly yaka yoo-hoo. And I thought, what am I ever going to do with that? I did research. I thought, is this somehow a Native American expression? With absolutely no success. So what I did is I took that and I made Yippee the main character, his best friend, the indigenous American who connected with him on the level of how their country had been stolen.
Right.
And when my siblings read that and my cousins, they overwhelming were like, oh, that's so clever that you
Yeah.
put that yippee and then his friends are Kineni and Thok and things like that. So that was one piece of not really dialogue, but a family story that
Story that, right. That you could not completely verify, but
right
but
other
that
than
you,
we heard it
other than you believe it's true, because why else would grandma have told you over and over and over,
over
right?
and over, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk some about the research that you had to do, because you were researching not only in Poland, but then you had to, I'm sure, do a lot of research here as well for when they arrived in the United States. What was the research like?
The research in Russia-controlled Poland was reading novels that were written during that time period, which is
Hmm.
the early 1900s. So she immigrated in 1906. So what was going on in Poland in 1900, 1890, she was
1890s, right?
born. Yeah, so a lot of reading novels written by Polish authors, some were translated, and getting into that history of that. And then the immigration period, like what was Ellis Island like at that time? Made two
Exactly.
trips to Ellis Island, met with the archivist there, and found out that Maud Mosher, who was a very important woman who did so much to help single women coming over from various countries and helping them integrate into the United States. She was there for 5 years, and it was right in the middle of the time when Stella arrives. She's there and
Hmm.
she helps her. And also, right when Stella arrived at Ellis Island, had just gone through a change in leadership, such that all the corruption and the bribery and the mistreatment of immigrants had just ended prior to Stella's arrival. So the fact that she was well treated at Ellis Island was something that's been brought up to me. People would say, readers would say, oh, I thought Ellis Island was like terrible. And I say, it was, but
Right.
not when Stella arrived.
Right. And that makes the story so that you can really understand, because like she arrives penniless because she's been robbed and she's penniless, and it could have been horrible. Can you imagine if she had arrived during a time when there was all of the terrible things happening in Ellis Island? She would
That's
have had a
right.
very different experience and may not have even have been able to come into the United States. She may have been sent back.
Exactly. And one of the most interesting things was finding the manifest and her detainee, the list at Ellis Island of the fact that she was detained for 3 nights, and she had to telegraph her father, who was living in Connecticut at the time, for him to send money. And that she arrived penniless was just mind-boggling to me.
Right.
Single, 16 years of age. That was, and my only recollection of this woman was as a young child, she lived across the street from me in Brewerton on the lake. And I
Mm-hmm.
just thought she was just your typical bopsy, grandma with her kerchief and her apron always, and you sort of tending to her flowers. And just the only memory I ever had was of her telling me to go out and pick field mushrooms.
Right. And so
Yeah, it's
to then be able to go back and find all of these things about her to make her more than that two-dimensional memory that you have as a little girl, I'm sure.
exactly.
What's the most unusual thing you found in your research, or something that surprised you that you didn't expect to find?
Well, it has to be, and I don't want to give away too much, or should
Right.
I just
No,
give
you don't give away too much, but if there's anything that you can tell me.
So Albin is Stella's husband.
Uh-huh.
Was shocked that there was absolutely no record of his marriage to Stella.
Yeah.
I was shocked to find evidence that he had returned to Poland, and this was right after World War II. He returned to Poland. They had a very small period of time when Poland was free, when Poland was not, under the control of a foreign country.
Right.
And then he spent 3 months in Poland and comes back. And the research, I had Polish genealogists that, helped me out, and to find the marriage certificate. And my mother, who's 92 years old, she's the baby on the cover of the book.
Right.
She couldn't believe it either.
I'm sure that whenever you uncover these little family skeletons, it does send a shockwave kind of through everyone, which brings me to the question, how has your family responded to this book?
Very, very well.
Okay.
Their eyes were opened, and having grown up in that the tradition of Polish American ways, they all know Vigilia. Vigilia is Christmas Eve at Henrika's house or Henrietta's house, and they know it. And so for me to have brought it to them, of everything our ancestors went through, right, and with the level of accuracy that they agreed to, they agreed that, yes, you've really captured this. They were really ecstatic. And
I'm glad to hear that.
One of my aunts, my Aunt Mary Ann, she's also still alive. So my mother and my Aunt Mary Ann are the only two of that third generation. If you think of this Polish mother being right, the 3 generations, my mother and her youngest sister, Mary Ann, are still living. And when Mary Ann read the end of the book, where my father is courting my mother, and Mary Ann is told by Henrietta, you need to stay and almost babysit your older sister.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a story that we all heard. And when she read that chapter where she was the little girl babysitting, which she was angry about for her whole life, because why would you make me do that? She literally cried. She said, Karen, you've captured this. I felt like I was there. And so they overwhelmingly were very pleased with the end result.
Great. With all the research, I know when I'm doing research, I have way more research than I ever get to put into the book. There's just, there's so many things and only so much can be put in the pages. Is there anything that you didn't put in that is still a really something that you're really glad that you found out?
I put a great deal of religious information in the first 20% of the book. Mm-hmm. The Polish people are predominantly Catholic, and they are extremely devout. And in the first chapter, when it's in Polish, it's Jak bądź pochwalony Jezus Chrystus, and it means may Jesus Christ be praised. And the response is always "Nie vekie vekie vama," which is forever and ever. And I just, from all my research, there was so much religion steeped in their everyday lives. When you go to Poland, there's shrines at crossroads. It's just every part of their life is steeped in that Catholic religion. And I ended up pulling out a lot. I felt like it was too much because people, my first group of readers, they were like getting bored. Yes, there's a lot of religion. It's almost like when somebody's preaching to you, you're like, okay, right, enough.
Okay, enough. Yeah. I get what you're talking about. I don't need more. Yeah.
And I just had to pull it out. I said, but there's so many customs and traditions. And they're like, yeah, well, okay, we get it. We get it after the first couple of mentions.
Right.
So that's a part of it. And really, they're very, very devout. And one of the strangest things was I had to fight with my mother, who was my editor-in-chief, because she really was lived it. She said Stella was not at all religious. She never went to church. And so I sort of went on that basis. But as I researched it, I said, there's no way that she could have not been religious when she was living in Poland. That would
Right.
never happen.
Right. Right.
And so, and you know how the story evolves.
Right. And
And
so
so,
so you have to figure out, like, at what point did she pull away?
right.
Right. And that's what you showed in the book.
Yeah.
I can imagine that, being that this is a family story, that you got very involved in these different stories and had a lot of your own memories. Did any memories come back to you while you were writing that you'd like kind of forgotten, but as you were writing or as you were doing research, all of a sudden it like came back to you and you were like, oh wow, I remembered something that you didn't remember before?
Actually, that would have been my mother.
Okay.
My mother, because I would write a chapter and then I would send it to her. And then she would say, oh, no, that's not how that happened. And then the memories would come back to her. I
Right.
clearly could never have written this story if my mom wasn't still alive. There's just no way. And she was pretty funny at times. She would say, things like, oh, no, Stella would never have done that. And then it would be a push and pull.
Right. Right.
Stella and Albin would never have kissed before marriage. That would never have happened. And, I gave her some leeway. I was like, okay,
Right.
I'll take that part out, or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
But absolutely, that flood of memories came back to her. The only memory that came back to me was when I was the little girl and my great-grandmother lived across the street and I didn't even know her. And my mother was like, no, don't go there. You can't bother grandma. You can't bother great grandma. You just stay away. And then at some point, I think I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I was like, I am so curious.
Who is that?
Who is this woman that I see across the street and I'm not allowed to talk to her? She's my great grandmother. So thank goodness I was curious, because literally I would never have met her if I had not been this little curious kid.
and then you have your memories. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed was finding out about the Polish traditions and then the Polish foods. There was a lot of information in there that led me to almost want to do more exploration and find out a little bit more about the customs. And today, in a Polish American community, are the customs as strong as they were in Stella's time, or have they started to dissipate? Have some of those started to go away?
So what we saw is after World War II, there was a great influx of Polish coming after World War II. Their country had been decimated. The Nazis absolutely, they had this. Some people might not know this, but not only did the Nazis murder millions of Jewish people, the Polish people were not far behind. They wanted to take their country, and they treated them, something 3 to 5 million Polish Christian Catholics were also murdered by the Nazis. So we had this great influx of Poles coming to America. So that would be the 1945, 1950 timeframe.
Mm-hmm.
So now in areas like Chicago, there's a pocket outside of Buffalo. There's some in all over the country, really.
Right.
Where they came over maybe in their teens. And so now they're going on 70, 80 years old, and they have kept those traditions alive. One of my husband's best friends came over when he was 13. And he absolutely, he sends me the apłatek, which is like a wafer. Think of it as like a communion wafer.
Okay.
And he last Christmas he sent us apłatek so we could share the communion bread at Vigilia, which is our Christmas Eve celebration. So there are pockets in this country that are very much still steeped in that Polish tradition. But I gotta say that as I was growing up, I would ask other classmates, "Do you celebrate Vigilia?" Or
and they didn't even know what it was.
They didn't know what it was, but
Yeah.
and I said, well, if you're Irish, what do you do? And and it seemed to me that the Polish people really grabbed onto them, and I think it's because their country was so oppressed, and they really didn't have a country for so long, that those traditions were what the Polish mother clung to. She said, well, how can I share this with my children and let them know how important our homeland was to us?
Right.
So I think that's uniquely Polish American. I do see it somewhat in the Italian as well, the Italian culture. They have the 7 fish dishes, and I don't know the Italian customs as well, but I sense that they've got that as well.
Well, and I know when I was doing research for my book, Sunflowers Beneath the Snow, the Ukrainian population has a similar attachment to very specific traditions. Once again, they were an oppressed country that often didn't have a country. They were being, run by a foreign government, and their traditions were the only thing that separated them from, from the people who were trying to oppress them. And so I think you're right that sometimes it has a lot to do with the history of the country. Yeah. And so if the country was having all of these issues and problems, then people clung to the things that made them, uniquely Polish or uniquely Ukrainian or uniquely Italian or whatever. So, yeah,
it's very true.
So I have to know, do you have recipes from real recipes that came down from grandmothers and things that are honest to goodness Polish food and not American Polish food that, it's like when you go to a Mexican restaurant and you're not really getting Mexican,
Yeah. Or chop suey and
yes,
the Chinese are like, what's chop suey?
Right, exactly.
So American. Oh, I do. I actually have I started a little recipe index card book, if you will, in 1990. And I remember going to Henrietta's house, and I stood in her kitchen, and she showed me how to make pierogi, which are the dumplings.
Right.
I have that recipe. My mother was really good at making babka, especially at Easter time, and it would always have a poppy seed filling or a walnut filling. And so I have that recipe of the babka, and I make to this day. I make guamki, which are, people think of them as cabbage rolls.
Okay.
But my guamki are so honed, and they're so delicious. They're just melt in your mouth. And the reason is because I've done this so many times over the years. But at one point I said, Mom, my guamki don't taste like yours. Yours are always so much better. She said, well, I've told you what I do. I said, you know what? I'm going to have to stand over your shoulder
and watch what you do.
And I did. And I picked up on that one thing. I said, you never told me to do this. She goes, oh, I thought I did. And so, it's just over the years doing it over and over. And my mother's very big on making pickles. And she eats cabbage like you can't believe. It's like a staple.
It's a staple
cabbage
food.
To Polish people is the undervalued vegetable, which is so important. I make beet soup, which is my mother's recipe. And over time, my 3 children have learned to love it. At first, they were like, no, I won't even taste it. But I was the type of mother where, you put it in front of your child, and if they didn't eat it, well, guess what? They would go away hungry. And the next time you put it in front of them, they're like, I guess that if I don't eat this, I'm going to be pretty hungry. And they learn to accept really wholesome, good, quality meals.
Yeah. When you were talking about your mother and having to stand over her, it reminds me of my son-in-law. The very first Thanksgiving that we had together, where he was at my house, I said, is there anything that your family makes that you would love for me to have at Thanksgiving? and he talked about this particular potato casserole that his grandmother made. So I contacted his grandmother, who didn't get back to me, but then I was able to get up with his aunt, and I got the recipe and I made it. And no one said a word. It was good. It tasted great. I had no idea what it was supposed to taste like, right? I followed the recipe. And I found out from my daughter later. She said, Mom, it was very sweet of you to do that. And the potato casserole tasted good, but it was absolutely nothing like the potato casserole that I ate at his grandmother's house at Christmas. And it was like, but I followed the recipe. And she said, well, I don't know. I'm just telling you. It wasn't the same food. And so I think it is kind of funny that there's a lot to cooking well beyond just the ingredients. And sometimes it's just like, when do you put what in? And you know, when people say things like a pinch, you know, and a dash, and you know, and my grandmother didn't measure things. And so you would watch what she would do, and she's just kind of like this, and you're like, okay, how do you know that that's the right amount? And it's just from years of having done what you do. So
yeah, like the only recipe in Polish America, Polish mother, is the crepe, making a crepe. And it's 3-2-1-1, 3 eggs, 2 tablespoons of water, 2 tablespoons of milk, and a pinch of salt. Oh, yeah, wait, flour. 3-2-1-1. Yeah. Sorry. 3 eggs, 2 tablespoons of flour, 1 tablespoon of water, 1 tablespoon of milk, and a pinch of salt. And I'll tell you, I make those and they're just perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. So you might want to consider putting out a Polish recipe book. I think that would be a fabulous addition to what you've got going on.
What I'm working on now is I'm working on my husband's story.
Oh, okay.
His history is even more fascinating.
And so do you want to give us a quick, like, what are we going to find in that book? Like, what is his history?
His history is goes back much further, and it starts in the early 1700s. He's one of, the Prescotts from Lincolnshire, England, and they came over and settled in New Hampshire, and his uncle settled in Boston, and Prescott, Arizona is named after one of his ancestors, but they pronounce it Prescott because of the cowboy influence.
Okay.
His family became very, very wealthy. They made furniture. They owned a company town in the Adirondacks. They're very, very well connected politically. His great-grandfathers met presidents. His great-great-grandfather built a house for a president in the Adirondacks. And by the time my husband came along, so this is maybe 7 generations later, there's no money left. So
it's like, oh, well.
So, all this prominence and all this money, and then where to go? What happened?
Right. Oh, that'll be fascinating. Do you have any idea of when you think that one might be out and available?
Well, Polish Mother took me 6 years.
Okay.
So it's because I do so much research. And I don't feel good about a chapter unless I've actually educated someone about something they may not have known about, because I'm a teacher by nature.
Okay. All right.
It's very slow going.
Right.
I would say 5 years.
Okay. Okay. Well, good. Good to know. We'll keep an eye out for that one. I'm curious what you think Stella would think if she could sit down and read your book.
Stella, I think she'd be very pleased.
Would she?
Very pleased. I don't know if I should say this, but I'm going to go for it. When I was really stuck in the middle of Polish Mother, there were some questions I could not resolve. I went to a medium, and I went there specifically, very, very questioning and doubtful that the medium could help me. But one of my friends, I was living in New York State at the time, she said, you got to try it. This lady's wonderful. I mean, you're not going to believe how good she is. So I went there and I said, I want to know about Stella. That's all I told her. Okay, she said, what's Stella's last name? Stella Kolakowski. And so she said, okay, give me a moment. And she said, oh, yes. Oh, Stella. Oh, yes, I see Stella. Stella wants you to know that she never would have come to America if she came after the Titanic, because she never would have risked it. And that I was like, oh, and I didn't tell her anything about Stella other than she was my great grandmother.
Right.
So I thought, okay, there's some authenticity to this. And then I said, what about Victor? And she said, Victor is running around in a cowboy hat and he's having the time of his life. He's playing cowboys and Indians. And I thought, oh my goodness.
Oh, that just kind of gives me goosebumps.
I know.
Yeah.
It's the truth. And those were the only tidbits she gave me that were useful. Unfortunately, she started to tell me my future, which I didn't want to know.
No.
So I sort of like cut it. And I said, you know what? You've told me what I needed to know. So my point is that I think that Stella didn't say whether she was pleased or not, but I feel like to have her story memorialized, I think she would be pleased about it, because she was a very private person, but such a hard worker, and having all those children,
yeah.
You know? And
yeah.
So yeah, I think she'd be happy about it.
Fantastic. Well, guys, if you want to keep this conversation going, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you will be able to pick up a copy of, or potentially win a copy of Karen's book, Polish Mother. So head on over there today for that. And Karen, if someone wanted to reach out to you, talk with you about this book, talk with you about being Polish American, or, the book that you're writing now, that maybe they have some ideas for you, how do they do that? Where do they find you?
They should go to my website. It's KarenWalczyk
Okay,
and in the
I'll have
upper
that
right
in the
hand,
show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, and then just contact. That goes to my
Super.
primary email. Yeah, contact
Fantastic.
me.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Karen, I want to thank you so much for being with me today. It has been a wonderful conversation, and everybody run right out and get Polish Mother and read the book. It's fantastic. You're going to love it.
Thanks so much, Terry. Great talking to you.
It was great talking to you as well. Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.